Good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen of the media, and I recognize all the leaders of the front and the activists who have joined us for this press statement. We have been criticized for having long press statements, and we are determined to make this one hopefully much shorter than we have had in the previous occasions. And this is really an end of year statement, a very difficult year that we have had. In fact, very difficult years that we have had in the recent past. And from October, we as the front have been talking about a crisis in our country. The crisis which we presented formally, officially to the country, with many areas highlighted that constitute this crisis. This crisis that we have been talking about is intensifying very fast and widening. And I think we don't need... Oh, there is a problem with the voice? Okay, since I'm alone, I hope you can sanitize your equipment when I finish. So the crisis that was presented in October has been getting deeper and wider. And we shall only touch on a few areas of that crisis, simply to show that deepening and widening of the crisis. The first is in the healthcare area, where, as you have been witnessing, many healthcare workers have been protesting what is going on in the healthcare system. Their conditions of work, the facilities or absence of facilities to use, and indeed their reward, what motivates them to work. And this is a matter that is not going to go away by just wishing it away. It's a matter that is going to be with us until we make fundamental decisions. So we had the strike of doctors recently, and I think today is the start of the strike of laboratory technicians across the country. And these are very, very many public healthcare workers on whose work all the others depend. Because a doctor cannot make a diagnosis without a laboratory technician doing his or her work. And so, even as they are trying to resolve the crisis caused by the interns and the senior house officers, now, even if those go back, they will not work because the laboratories on which they depend are going on strike. So there is a deep problem, crisis in the healthcare sector that definitely needs a fundamental attention to that area. There is a crisis which I'm sure everybody here will be affected by, of education. Our children have been, as we have pointed out before, out of schools longest in the entire world. And now some flimsy statements have been made regarding how they go back to school. And it's anybody's guess how those schools will function. To start with, they have said that those who are clogging the same levels of education, some will go ahead and join higher classes. So we now have 2 years of senior 1. All of them just finished primary 7. Nobody has studied the first year in secondary. So some of the P7 graduates are going to senior 2. Those who finished senior 5, senior 4 are going to senior 6. They are candidates. They were candidates of senior 4. Now they are candidates of senior 6. Without going through any preparation. So this is total chaos that our schools have been lumped with. They have been told that each school will figure out how the students who have not had education of the previous class will combine that education of the previous class with the present one. Every school will find its own way of figuring out. Now, this is not a way to manage education. So clearly, a generation of Ugandans is destroyed by all this incompetence and chaos that has been occasioned to our education system. Now, even as they say kids should go back, nobody's caring how many can actually afford to go back. They are just saying we are going to open schools, but how will kids get back? When their parents themselves were locked down for 2 years, have no capacity to take their children back to school. How will kids go back to school? Other problems have occurred in the last 2 years. We have now thousands and thousands of children mothers. Those who were in schools who are now mothers. No policy, no guidance on how these school children who are mothers will have their education, or have we condemned them not to have education? So there is a crisis, a deepening crisis in education. Teachers, nobody is really figuring out how many teachers will actually turn up for the new year and in what shape they will be. Because even these teachers have not been in class for a very long time. Some have been engaged in totally different activities, making bricks and selling chapatis and so on. So in what form, how many are the teachers coming back? How will they be able to undertake this? Nobody has an idea about all this. The third crisis we want to touch on is the crisis of local governments. We have a lot of duties that were decentralized, roles that were decentralized to local governments, including cities and urban authorities. Last year we created, were there 9 or 8 more cities? Eh? How many? 8. It's not easy to keep count. So we have now 9 cities. We have many municipal authorities and town councils or divisions of cities. These are local governments that have direct responsibilities of service to the citizens. These local governments all over the country, they are bankrupt. No money. They are non-functional. The local governments we are talking about. Apart from some salaries that come from the central government to the workers who are in the local governments, there is really nothing going on in all these areas. Yet, all these local governments and urban authorities are choking with debt because the underfunding has been chronic. Thirdly, in the crisis we are talking about is the post-COVID recovery of businesses and persons' livelihoods. The businesses that were locked down, many of them collapsed as a result. And up to now, there is clearly no plan that is being implemented to revive, to resuscitate these businesses, especially the small businesses and the micro businesses on which Ugandans depend. If you look at the neighborhood, a lot of specific actions were taken to revive people's livelihoods and businesses. Like in Kenya, they reduced VAT from 16 to 14%. They reduced income tax and the thresholds to provide people relief so that they can recover. They reduced borrowing rates, bank rates, so that people can borrow and resuscitate their businesses. They provided support for the small enterprises and micro businesses to recover their activity. Here, the contrary happened. Taxes were increased. Borrowing rates are high because the government is the biggest borrower in our market anyway. And there is no support to people. Businesses in towns are closing. The landlords, there was no indication or guidance about how people who did not trade, who did not work for months, their businesses closed. Some are still closed. The bars and other businesses are still closed 2 years. Are they supposed to continue paying rent as their businesses are closed, or what happens to this? So there is a lot of challenge for the crisis is intensifying for businesses and persons. There is still a challenge, a crisis of security. And we have a curfew now for 2 years, which curfew is being used not to control COVID, but to extort money from the already poor people. The borders, everywhere you find, they are laying ambushes for them to extort money. To extort money from people who have delayed to close their shops or whatever. To extort money from all kinds of suffering and struggling Ugandans. Curfew is not a COVID measure. It is simply maybe some kind of a security measure of the state, or simply a way of keeping those security people earning since they are not being paid or paid enough. Then amidst all this crisis, of course, our forces went to Congo illegally. They continue to be in Congo. Our children who get problems, like I have heard some, there are already some casualties. They are getting casualties while acting in contravention of our constitution, in contravention of our laws. spending resources that would possibly be alleviating some of these crises in violation of our laws and our constitution. Now, we addressed that last time, and so I wouldn't need to dwell on it. Lastly, amongst the crises we want to highlight is the impunity regarding the will of the people, which we saw in Kayunga. You know, just last week. The kind of total disregard for people's will. Of course, this is what has been going on in all the elections that this country has organized. In fact, since we became Uganda in 1960, we became an independent Uganda in 1962, we have never had an election that can be used to have people's will expressed. The elections are used to suppress the people's will rather than to express it. Whether it's the 1980 election, which sparked off the war that brought this regime to power, whether it's the elections organized under this junta, all of them are extremely disturbing. Now elections are, for all intents and purposes, armed engagements. They are periods of war. As soon as an election is declared, the members roll out of the barracks. The soldiers and with the chains of bullets wrapped around them advance to the elections. Those are the types of elections that we are talking about. And so this, as you know, is the very basis why the People's Front for Transition was launched. Because we came to the very clear conclusion that elections in and of themselves will not take away armed rule in our country, military rule in our country. And so that is a fundamental crisis that the country must continue to grapple with. That we are ruled by people who are doing so in complete disregard of what the owners of the country think about them. So in conclusion, we are finishing 2021 with a challenge as a country of how to deal with this deepening, widening crisis that we of course characterized in summary as a crisis of failure to thrive by our people. And so, as we possibly break off for the holiday season, end of year holiday season, we want to make it categorically clear that key interventions, urgent interventions, must be undertaken one way or another. And these key interventions are the main thrust of this briefing. First, there has to be a special fund for all government and government-aided schools to deal with the reopening of schools 2022. The fund that will make it possible for those schools not only to open, but to provide decent education service to our children without parents having to be made to pay for children to go back to school. 2022. It's not enough just to say, let children go back to school. Money must be put in place. First of all, those government schools that were being supported by government, the support that was being given was already minuscule. It could not provide education to anybody. It was minuscule. It was a lie. We must provide funding for every child that is registered in a government school to cover their education costs for 2022, so that all registered children are able to go back to school and to access learning processes. Secondly, a special fund must be provided for private schools. For private schools that are registered by government, that have been paying taxes to government, a special fund must be provided to these schools ahead of opening. Private schools provide 20% of all the education services in this country. 1 in 5. These are our children. They are not, these are children of Ugandans who are accessing these private schools. So they must. Now, these schools have collapsed because they couldn't pay loans. They couldn't pay their staff to maintain them. They have collapsed. They must be supported by a special fund ahead of opening. Thirdly, the teachers we are telling to go back and teach surely will not teach if paid what they were being paid. It won't happen. So we are again telling a lie to open schools for teachers to go on a strike. Why should we do that? Because what they were being paid, very little as it was then, has now been greatly overtaken by inflation. The cost of living has, escalated in the country at the time we are telling these teachers to go back to teach. Are we just telling them to report at school and just hang around there? Or we want our children to learn? Teachers must be paid if we want our children to learn. And as we have pointed out before, the strength of any country is the knowledge in that country. We have undermined our country already enough by denying the building of knowledge for 2 years. It cannot continue. So we must pay teachers. The remuneration of teachers must be stepped up to match the inflation, to match the workload that they will be required to deliver on. Because as we have said, they have been directed to teach what should have been taught in 2 years in 1 year. It means they will have to work overtime to try and get these kids to catch up. When not paying them, that simply cannot work. We must raise the salaries, the statement must be out before they go back. Fourthly, there has to be a policy on child mothers that we have created and provision for them to go back to school. So maybe arrangements for nurseries at the school where their kids can be kept as the kid mothers are in class, or whatever necessary arrangements. There has to be a policy on how these kid mothers continue with their education. 5, a fund for the urgent health care improvements that have been presented by the healthcare workers. It's not enough to say we have now a supplementary to pay their salaries. Yes, maybe if you pay interns a little more, they may go back to the hospitals. But it is us paying them that added money, yet we are not going to get treatment, even if they go back to the hospitals. We who have increased their salaries, how are we going to get health care when there are no facilities for them to use where they are? Even themselves, how will they be confident to work on us when there are no protective materials for them to use, when their colleagues died of COVID the other day and are still dying? So this cannot be something that is treated by just tinkering on the edges of their request. We have to provide a special fund to urgently deal with the improvements that are necessary in our healthcare system, including, of course, remunerating them commensurately. Number 6, we must also equally pay attention, because, dealing just piecemeal with public sector delivery of services cannot work. Like I said, if you pay doctors and lab technicians are not working, you have not solved anything. Similarly, if you deal with healthcare system and you don't deal with the system that supports the healthcare system will not work. All of public service is integrated. Therefore, our 6th demand is that service conditions for all public servants, including the policemen who are harassing us, because the reason they are extorting money, give me 5,000, and being humiliated on the roads and their offices begging and extorting money, is that they have nothing to eat, And we have continuously advocated for proper pay for all our servants, and especially those who provide security services. The police and the UPDF must be paid decently so that they don't have to rely on illegal means of trying to survive. So the whole public sector of our country must have a review of their remuneration in line with inflation, because everything is running away. How do people cope? Fuel, which was 3,000 the other time, is now coming to 5,000. It's about 5,000. And that impacts on all other costs. Number 7, we have to have urgently a special economic stimulus package that tackles taxation. As we have already said, part of the tax policy of government is ill-advised, even without the difficulties we are in. Because when you put taxes very high, you cause people to find all ways of avoiding it. Tax avoidance increases correspondingly. But secondly, consumption, because prices are high, consumption becomes low. People can't afford the prices. And when they are not buying, although you have tax on the commodities, nobody's paying that tax. So if you lower taxes and people consume more, although you are getting a small tax on every item, because of the increased consumption, you get more than the one who is taxing highly. They have never got it. But now this is a crisis, and we have to review this. We have to especially directly deal with the rising fuel prices. And Kenya has intervened, as it should. There has to be an intervention, because fuel prices, as I have said, impact the rest of the economy. Interest rates must be adjusted, and they will not be effective as long as the government is still the biggest borrower in our market. We must capitalize, and there should be a very clear fund and accessibility to the fund by small businesses and micro businesses on how to restart and improve their businesses. Electricity and water must be addressed. I had some flimsy sounds about electricity prices. Just flimsy. We must deal with electricity. We should have the cheapest electricity in the world, because our electricity is almost free. It is provided by water that God moves around. Nobody pays water to run. In the river Nile, it runs on its own. And by running, it generates power very, very cheaply. You just put a wheel, and it turns the wheel and gives you power. Why should we pay that power so expensively that we have to now destroy all the trees and all kinds of things? The power and the water must be addressed. Rent on the locked down businesses must be addressed. Rent on the locked down businesses. Bank interests on the locked down businesses must be addressed. Number 8, we must urgently provide funding for local governments, cities, and urban authorities. Because those, as I have said, they are the providers of the basic services to the people, and they are bankrupt. Number 9, curfew must end so that people can move and work. Curfew has to come to an end. Lastly, the UPDF, which continues to fight in Congo unconstitutionally, and which we addressed a whole conference on, should withdraw. And we talked about how the ADF problem can be addressed, and we believe that it can indeed be addressed without us deploying the forces and spending the colossal amounts of money that we are spending when there is all this crisis. that we have to deal with. And so, having said that, all that needs money. All those 10 measures are 10 measures of expenditure. We believe that money is there. We don't have to create, we don't have to print that money. That money is there. It has to be reorganized. You may have heard the Inspector General of Government formally inform the country that every year we lose 10 trillion in corruption. 10 trillion. Now, when we talk about 1 trillion, it's unimaginable for an ordinary Ugandan. 1 trillion. Because 1 trillion is 1,000 billion. 1 billion is 1,000 million. Now, many Ugandans have never even had 1 million. So you can imagine 1,000 million that becomes a billion. And 1,000 billion that make 1 trillion. But every year they are stealing 10 trillion. Every year. It is the money Mr. Museveni said, go slow, don't hunt them down. They are building for us 5-star hotels. It's all right. And of course we know who has built those 5-star hotels. You know? Mr. Museveni himself said when he retires, he will go into his hotel and real estate businesses. So most likely he's actually talking about himself. They should go slow on him. So the money is not the problem. The problem is that it's simply we have put it forward to be used by individuals on their estates. We should recover this money and apply it to this crisis. The wasteful expenditure, the most notorious of course of which is State House. State House, for heaven's sake, is supposed to be the home of a president. That is what State House is. Expenditure there should be the expenditure of the home. Food, washing maybe things, cleaning the compound. That is the expenditure of State House, nothing else. Anything to do with the work of the president is in the president's office, not in State House. But we have now State House taking more money than about 5 ministries combined to go to the home. The COVID money we borrowed. Last year you saw 1 trillion going to State House for secret work in the home. What secret work is there in the home? So it's not money, the wasteful expenditure. If we cut it, if we cut all the wasteful expenditure around the government, it's enough to apply to these urgent interventions that we have talked about. And of course, they are the wrong priorities that are consuming a lot of money. Wrong priority, which is maybe not stolen, but applied to wrong things. And, you know, the whole wrong infrastructure, you find, you know, trillions applied on an infrastructure project that is just a white elephant. And, you know, there are so many of those. And lastly, in the recovery of, in assembling of the money needed in these interventions, is that the remuneration going around from our purse, from the public purse, must be rationalized across the board. Today you have some people earning 50 million from the public purse per month. Others, like we have noted doctors who are doing incredibly important job and working 24 hours on the wards. These interns getting 700,000. Somebody is getting 50 million from the public purse. It's okay if you're a businessman paying, your company is paying you 100 million, I won't complain. But what comes out of the public purse must be rationalized. Having said that, there is a crisis, there are urgent demands. It's possible to meet the demands as we break for the holiday. We all must put a focus on ensuring that these interventions are undertaken. These interventions, which are interventions for our survival, must be undertaken. The 10 interventions have to be undertaken urgently. The ones which, for example, impact on the education of our children have to be undertaken ahead of the children, again, being wasted in the schools they say should open. And the calendar that has been announced is that the schools will open on the 10th of January. So actually we are saying that these interventions should be in place by the end of the first week of January. Yes. These are matters of life and death for citizens. It cannot continue being a joking matter. We joke, we perish. And so by the end of the first week, we shall make the review with a view to getting all Ugandans to now take action to cause these changes that are necessary. As everybody has seen, without any action, nothing would happen. If those interns had not fought, even the little that they are being promised is about to come would not come. Nothing comes without fighting for it. We are therefore, we have been, since the last conference at JEMA headquarters, we told you we are starting the move to rally our activists, the Red Card Front activists, to rally them for action. And we have some plan. We had laid out a plan for doing so. But in light of this urgent and intensifying crisis, we have taken a decision to accelerate that plan so that by the end of the first week, Indeed, we are in a position to have the Red Card Front activists in a position to coordinate and guide our people in whatever actions will be necessary thereafter. So we are not going to have a holiday really. We are going to be working overtime to get ourselves in a position that can help to coordinate and guide fellow Ugandans in this process of working for the changes that we need to save us. And everybody has a duty, as we have already said. The actions we are talking about are actions imposed on us by Article 3 of our Constitution. And Article 3 imposes a duty on every Ugandan. So this is not a matter for BSJ, for Lord Mayor, for Honorable Mukaku here. No, this is a matter for every Ugandan. Finally, as you all know, this week or this weekend will be Christmas. And so I think it's in order that we also talk about Christmas. The life and the mission of Christ, whose birth all Christians celebrate this week, is very relevant to the times our country is in today. Christ was born during a very oppressive rule of the Roman Empire. At that time, religious leaders had actually been corrupted and worked closely with the oppressive rulers. The judges didn't dispense justice, but dispensed the will of the rulers. And the people lived in fear of the rulers. Those were the times in which Jesus Christ was born. And the ministry of Christ, his work, which only lasted 3 years, was about pushing back against this injustice while preaching love and dignity for all. And as you remember, those of you who are conversant with the Bible, Christ had to throw tables when he found the synagogues themselves being messed up because of corruption. He became, quite agitated and turned the tables and threw out everybody. So the work of Jesus prioritized those who were weak and marginalized. In fact, as again the Bible scriptures say, his message was that if you lose one sheep, you'd rather leave the others and go to seek the one that has been lost. That was at the center of his ministry. Now, he was persecuted and killed on the Roman cross. But today, Christ has the largest number of followers in the world. About 2.5 billion people follow Christ, only followed by the followers of Islam, who I think are about 1.9 billion. And the headquarters of the Roman Empire is the seat of the Pope. So the pursuit of justice and dignity for our people should be inspired by the life and ministry of Christ, whose birth we remember and celebrate this week. The terror and persecution we confront should confirm to us that we are on the right path. So, to all Christians out there in Uganda, let's celebrate the birth and life of Christ in spite of the terrible times we are in. On behalf of the Red Card Front, or the People's Front for Transition, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year when it comes. And I've said all this for God and my country.